you're applying to graduate school workshop, because for most people who are on graduate school admissions committees, the writing sample is in some sense the most important part that's up to you. So if you're watching on the internet, you can find links to all the files that we're using. So what we'll do today is do a PowerPoint presentation about writing samples, and then we'll do an exercise that has a couple of handouts. And those are all available at amyeberg.com/SPWP. So if you're watching online, you can go to that website and follow along. And also all of those things will be available there, and maybe on the summer program's website too, forever. So you're welcome to refer back to them if you need to as you write a writing sample. So what we're going to do today is first talk about the process of coming up with a writing sample, how to pick a topic, how to work on it, how to revise it. Then I've gathered some advice from people who have repeatedly been on our graduate admissions committee, and we'll talk to them about what they think makes for a good writing sample, what they look for, what they dislike. I'll go through a couple of additional resources that you might find helpful either now or later when you're attempting big writing projects like a dissertation. And then finally what we'll do is we'll look at two pieces of my writing. First, the final paper that I turned in that got an A that turned into my writing sample. And then after a period of revision, how that became a writing sample that got me in here. So we'll talk about things those pieces of writing do well, things they do badly, and how they change over time. So feel free to ask questions anytime. And when you ask questions, if you wouldn't mind saying your name so that I can try to learn some of your names while you're here. Speaking of which, any questions so far? Okay, so the process of doing a writing sample. The first thing to know is that this is a really, for most people, so I guess one big lesson here is that people on admissions committees disagree about what's important. Some people think GREs are really important, most people don't. Most people think writing samples and letters from faculty are the two most important components of your sample. And those are, only one of those is really up to you. So you're going to spend a finite amount of time on GRE studying. You're going to spend some time on your personal sample. But the writing sample is the thing you can spend the most time on that is likely to make the biggest difference in whether you get into grad school, which grad schools you get into, what faculty you're looking for when they're thinking about whether you'd be a good part of their graduate community. So this is the reason that we're devoting a whole session to it. It takes a lot of work. Don't underestimate how much work this will take to produce a good writing sample, and it's up to you, and it matters quite a bit for graduate school admissions. So we're going to talk about 4 stages of this process. First, picking a writing sample, then getting a team together to work on it with you, then how you might go about revising it, and then the final steps you'll go through for making sure that your writing sample is really polished, really your best foot that you put forward to grad schools. So when you think about the timeline, I think you should think about starting quite early. So I would suggest starting this summer, or at least at latest the early fall, before you plan to go to grad school. You probably will have lots of other stuff going on. So if you're a senior, you've got classes. If you are out of school and working, you've got a job. It'll take a long time, and you won't be able to devote 24 hours a day to your writing sample. So you should start early. You also should be getting other people involved. Us, your faculty, other undergrads, and it takes time for them to read your writing sample, return it with comments, for you to digest those comments, for you to turn around another draft to them or to someone else. So because that takes time, you want to start early because you're also depending on other people. So what you want to wind up with is a paper that's like papers you can produce in grad school. You want to show the admissions committee that after a couple of years in grad school, this is the kind of work that you'll be capable of. So it should be better than your standard good work that you're doing right now, because you want people to be able to see in the future, after some training, this is really what she's going to be able to do. People aren't generally expecting you to produce this kind of work all the time right when you land in grad school, but they want to know, looking forward, what you'll be capable of. So the first step here is to figure out what you want to use for your writing sample. So the first option is to use just something that got an A, something you feel good about, and just turn that right around and send it off to schools. This is not the right strategy in almost all cases, because what people are looking for is a graduate school quality paper. And so something that got an A in undergrad is rarely work that makes you seem like a good grad student. Sometimes it is, but often, I mean, I give A's to papers all the time that I would not want to see coming from people who want admission to a graduate program. So what you want is not a term paper or a thesis chapter as it is, but you want to pick something that got an A or maybe an A- that you think you would enjoy working on until you're totally sick of working on it, and you want people who will help you work on it. That's the kind of thing you want to start with, but it's not the kind of thing that you want to send out right away. So if you want to use something that you've written before, you want to expect to spend plenty of time revising it, even if it got an A. Another option is to start something from scratch. Sometimes this works, but it's not a strategy that I would recommend in general. The reason is that you don't have a lot of experience yet assigning yourself paper topics. So most of the paper topics you get in undergrad, somebody else tells you this is an appropriate topic for a 5 to 10 page paper. For most people, when you're starting out picking a paper topic, you tend to pick things that are too broad. In fact, for most professional philosophers, when they pick something to write on, it turns out to be too broad, and they wind up writing on a smaller thing because new objections come up, you can find out more literature. So if you decide, I'm going to send a really impressive writing sample where I prove that utilitarianism is true, or I prove once and for all that God doesn't exist, it's going to be too broad. And so if you start from scratch, you also have to pick new literature. Faculty who would be willing to help you revise may be less willing to help you pick something from scratch and assign you a whole bunch of reading. You'll have less time to do all that reading from scratch. So there are reasons you might do this. So maybe you just come to philosophy as a junior or senior and you haven't written a lot of things you love. Maybe over the summer you decide you're going to read everything in philosophy of religion and you want to work on philosophy of religion, and so you want to write a writing sample from scratch. I think in general it's a strategy you should avoid even in those cases. There are some reasons you might start from scratch, but I think you're likely to produce better work if you start with something that's already good and then you make it better. So instead you might pick a term paper that you've already written, or how many of you plan to write a senior thesis? Okay, so a decent number of you will have this choice to make. You might also choose a thesis chapter. And there are pros and cons to both of these. So if you pick a term paper, by definition, you're picking something that asks and answers a smaller question. Theses are broader. And so that's good. You might have less to read to get yourself up to speed on more of the work in that area. It might be easier for you to deepen your analysis across the whole paper. On the other hand, if you are like me or everyone else who's ever lived, term papers are rarely your best work. Sometimes they are, but often you wrote them when you were tired or busy or working on other stuff, or they're bad for less salubrious reasons. So a thesis should be your best work. It should be something where you worked really hard for a semester or a year with one faculty member, you read a lot in that area. On the other hand, the downsides are that a thesis is longer. You want something that's about 12 to 20 pages, and it can be hard to pick from a long thesis a part that asks and answers a single question that you can answer well in 20 pages. You may be able to revise a 10 or 20 page chunk of your thesis, but it might be a little bit harder to do that. You need it to have original content, right? So it shouldn't just be a lit review or a recap of what somebody else said. You want it to contain original analysis, and that can be harder to do with a thesis. On the other hand, you probably have closer faculty supervision, but not all faculty supervisors are good ones. And you want to pick something that you've written with somebody you think is enthusiastic about you, wants you to go to grad school, wants to see you succeed, is willing to devote a lot of time. Sometimes that's your thesis supervisor, but not always. Plus, there's this question of timing. So if you plan to apply to grad school during your senior year of college, you basically have to be done with your writing sample by December 1st. That's, I think, more or less when the earliest deadlines are. And you probably want a buffer so that in case you are delayed for whatever reason, you have some time. So if you're writing a year-long thesis, you need a really good chunk of that done in the fall, and you need to be revising, and you need to be picking out a chunk that is a writing sample. So if you want to apply in your senior year, that may not work. If you're writing a fall thesis, it'll be done, but you've got to be writing it and revising it at the same time. So theses, you bump up against this question of timing. So one option is to take a year off, be after college, before grad school, work on your writing sample then. I mean, I don't think this is the right thing to do just because you want a really good writing sample, but there are advantages and disadvantages. So one disadvantage is that you have to do this revision remotely. So some faculty are good at answering emails, they'll respond quickly, you're at the front of their mind. Other faculty are really bad at responding to emails quickly. And so you should think about whether someone you want to work with is capable of working with you remotely. On the other hand, you have the full sweep of your college work to choose from. Papers you wrote spring semester senior year, a year-long thesis. It may be easier for you to judge with a little distance with your whole portfolio which things will be good writing samples. So what I did was I took a year off. I worked for a year. I had a thesis. I'd written a year-long thesis, but I used a seminar paper instead because the person I wrote my thesis with was really inaccessible over email. He had no excuse. Like, he was in his 40s. Like, it was really bad. But he was really, I mean, this was just a fact. If I tried to do my writing sample with him, it wasn't going to work. So I chose a different professor who was much more accessible over email, much better at responding. So this isn't relevant really to our topic, but I think for me, taking a year off and working before I went back to grad school was absolutely the right choice. And if you ever want to talk about deciding on your timeline, if you're thinking about going to grad school, I'd be happy to talk to you now or later about making that decision and why I think it worked for me. But anyways, back to writing samples, you might also be in this position where you're choosing between different papers. So you might have written a paper that's really good on personal identity, but you think personal identity is really boring. On the other hand, you might have written this less good paper on, I don't know, consequentialism, but you love consequentialism and you really want to work on consequentialism when you get to grad school. How do you pick? I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages to this too. So admissions committees like to get a sense of what you'll be like as a grad student. So if you're sending them something that's in an area you want to work on, they can say, oh yeah, she'd be a great fit for working with Dick Arneson. And we can see that because her writing sample, her personal statement all say, this woman wants to do consequentialism in grad school. And if you're working on the paper a lot, which you should be, then it can be easier sometimes to work on something you really enjoy. But if the paper that you're thinking about working on is substantially weaker or more half-baked, then it may be better for you to go with a really good paper. Because admissions committees also, in addition to getting a sense of the kind of stuff you want to work on, they also want to see what you'll be like as a grad student. And you can make up for something that isn't in your area of interest in other ways, like saying in the personal statement, you know, I really want to work on the ethics of war, even though my paper's on Kant. So if you can't figure out which paper you want to pick, and you're in this position where you've got a couple papers, the next thing you should do is start to think about people you can work with. So I recommend starting by thinking about one person that you know will be willing to work with you over lots of revisions and give you frank advice and knows the area. And probably that's either your thesis advisor or the person who taught the class that the paper is from. So when you are thinking about someone you want to work with mainly, go to them and say, honestly, do you think this is something that could become a good writing sample for grad school? Hopefully they'll say yes. Hopefully they'll say yes and actually honestly mean it. You know, you may not be able to judge that, but you want to ask them, is there, you know me, is there something that would be better than this that I should be sending rather than this paper? So one option then is to do an independent study with them. And in the fall, focus on making a paper into a writing sample paper. Some faculty will be willing to do this, others may not have the time, but that's one option. That's also if you think you want to write a writing sample from scratch. This is getting an independent study is the best way to do it. I think it's still not the strategy I would recommend, but it's the best way to make sure that you're really reading a lot, you're writing it carefully. But even if you're not writing something from scratch, an independent study can be helpful in getting you ready for grad school. So you've got one person, and then you should try to get as many other people on board as possible. So other faculty in your department, people who are writing you letters of recommendation, at least in theory, like you, think you're a good philosopher, think you should go to grad school. If they think that, hopefully they're willing to at least read it over once or maybe twice. They'll see different things than your main faculty member will see. And so it's good to get the opinions of as many people as possible. If you're in a department with a PhD program or a master's program, ask grad students to read your writing sample. They just did this. They will also see things that faculty won't see. If you've got a big undergrad program, people are going to grad school or are just solid philosophy majors, have them read your writing sample, exchange writing samples, get as many people to read it as possible. And then although they won't be able to help necessarily with the philosophy side of it, writing centers are a great resource here because what philosophers aren't always great about noticing is stuff like voice, basic grammatical conventions, writing centers are really good at. So take it to your writing center, see if they can read it over and just tell you how it sounds from a writing perspective. And then finally, in the past years, the summer program has asked people if they're interested to send writing samples to us. We'd love to read your writing sample, give you feedback from people who have been in the program, not past participants, but current grad students who've been involved, faculty who are in your area. And so we would love to be a resource for you as you do this. So those are some of the tools that you can think about using, and I would recommend using as many of these as you feasibly can in the time that you're working on your writing sample. Any questions so far? Yeah.
For those of us at small schools, is it important or helpful to try to pick a writing sample in a professor's research area so that they can give you more help with literature or advice, or how would you suggest managing that?
Yeah, so I think for small schools and large schools, your best bet is to work with somebody who knows the area that you are writing in. So you'll know that because they taught a class, so at least in theory they've got some expertise in that area, but you can also look at the CVs, their resumes on the website, and see if they have written things in that area. That can be a good way to judge, especially if they've written things recently. And if they haven't, philosophers are just generally good at philosophy, so they may be able to help you with things that are outside of their area. I mean, they will be able to help you with some things, whether the argument's strong. They'll be less good at saying, oh yeah, blah-de-blah just wrote a book on this, and you should read that. So I think you're better off picking things that they have some expertise in. And that is harder at small schools, but you also want to do that if you're at a larger school. Yeah. Did you have one?
Hi, my name's Emma.
Oh, yeah, Emma.
I was told by somebody at my school in Toronto that if you're applying in one area but you say you'd like to work in another, it's a good idea to have like a backup writing sample in case they ask for it. How common is it for admissions committees to ask you for that one? Like, should you polish that one as well?
You should, if you think that you might have a backup writing sample, you should polish it. So if they can ask for something, if they want to ask for something, then if you think that there's a potential that they'll ask for something because you've said in your letter, I love philosophy and physics, but here's a writing sample in Mill, then maybe you should definitely have it polished if you think there's a chance.
Okay.
I don't think that's common.
Okay.
It may happen more, like, so maybe Toronto's program does that more than other programs, so, maybe there are places that do it, and then you would want that to be polished and prepared. Some people send multiple writing samples. So in a situation like this, I love Kant, but I wrote on physics. They might send a sample on Kant and a sample on physics. I don't recommend that as a first strategy because A, you'll have less time to put into each writing sample, so they'll be a little bit less polished. And B, if you do that, probably what will happen is the committee will assign each writing sample to the committee member who knows it best. Or they'll ask for people outside the admissions committee to read, you've got expertise in philosophy and physics, can you read this physics paper and tell us what's good? And if there's a split decision, they're more likely to go with the person who says, I don't think this person is a good fit with our program. So giving two writing samples can lead to split decisions, and those tend to not go in your favor. So I think you run that risk if you polish a writing sample and you don't send it off. Because if you're polishing 2 writing samples, then you're spending less time on each. But then if you send both off right away, there's this additional risk that you get a split decision.
Okay.
So Emma, and what was your name? Who asked?
Oh, Jessa.
Jessa. So Jessa, Emma, and Ariana. Yeah. What's up?
So I have, so I'm applying to, I have several interests and I'm applying to a bunch of different programs. And there's one program where, it's Warwick, Peter Pullman is there, for Nietzsche. And I have a historical philosophy that's really super duper polished. The only thing is I worry, okay, if I send it to him, am I going to be stuck with Peter Pullman and not, say I have this other interest in moral psychology or something else? Am I not going to be able to move over if I realize I don't want to work on Nietzsche personally?
So I can't speak for every graduate program, but I think certainly at UCSD we expect plenty of people, maybe most people, but certainly a significant chunk of people who come in to not write dissertations on the things they wrote their writing sample on, even if they say in their personal statements. I can't speak for all programs, particularly I don't know if programs in the UK are different. They may be, since in the UK you're more like going straight into your thesis. So,
well, you'd have to do a master's. You can't go straight to PhD.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So that might give me time anyway. I was just sort of thinking, because right now my plan is I have at least 2 good writing samples, and so I was thinking, okay, if I have 2 or 3 interests, I might be sending out different writing samples depending on who I'm, going to. But maybe that's a bad idea. Maybe I should just say, this is my number 1 interest. I'm only going to send this writing sample. I'm only going to package myself this way for fear of being, trapped in one interest.
Yeah, I don't think packaging is a real worry, because I think most people at least shift a little bit, and some people shift dramatically from what they thought they would do coming in.
So packaging is a good idea.
Sorry?
So packaging is a good idea.
Yeah. And I think if you've got 3 things you're thinking about, that's fantastic, but you should pick one and it should be the most polished thing, and you should put your energy into polishing that, because people don't expect you to be a Nietzsche scholar forever just because when you're 22 you think Nietzsche is the thing that I want to do forever.
Okay.
Okay, anything else? Okay, so next, starting to think about revising the thing that you've already picked, or if you've started something from scratch, thinking about what you want to aim for, and after you've written an initial draft or 2, thinking about how you revise it. So what you want is a paper that's between 12 or 20 pages. So if it's shorter than 12 pages, it's less likely to contain a really good, strong, self-contained argument. It's possible, but it's less likely. Beyond 20 pages, and some people just won't read it, or they won't read the whole thing, or they won't read the parts that you're hoping that they'll read. Now, some people are fine with a longer paper. They say, we'll talk about this again when we talk about advice from admissions committee members. They say, just put a note on the front saying, I'd like you to read the introduction and pages 3 through 5 and pages 16 through 25, or something like that. So some people are fine with that, but most people don't prefer it. And so when you're writing a grad school writing sample, you're kind of hedging your bets. And so even though some people are okay with a longer writing sample, you want to write something that isn't going to make most people irritated that you wrote something really long and then sort of tacitly expected them to read it all. So 20, I've heard from a number of people, should be a hard cap. And in fact, 15 to 18 pages might be even better. Don't push the length cap. Now, the first thing you probably want to do is go back and reread everything that you read for the writing sample when you wrote it as a paper or as a thesis. So you might have missed things that you'll see on a second reading of the literature. Because you were reading it for writing a paper for a class. Your professor focused on 1 or 2 main areas. You want to bring in more of the stuff you've already read. And then you want to bring in related literature. So if you wrote a paper for a class, you read 1 or 2 or 3, maybe 4 things on that topic. But a sure sign of something that somebody wrote for a seminar is that they cite 1 or 2 things exclusively, because you were writing it for a class. You were writing about the stuff that you read. So you want to show that you're capable of doing independent research and synthesizing it on your own and bringing in things that are related to the things that you initially read. And when I say independent research, I don't mean not getting help. You want to ask your faculty member, what other things should I read on this topic? But you want to show that you're curious and you're capable of reading things on your own, even when it's been suggested to you. So read related things. And then think about changing something from an essay prompt into a real paper. So when you wrote an essay prompt, the best responses to papers do this less, but of course it's really easy to think, my professor knows what I'm talking about. She knows the background assumptions of this debate, we've talked about it in class. I don't have to define my terms as carefully because we've defined them in class. So what you want to do is think, how would this be communicated to somebody who's never read this stuff? What background assumptions are there? How should I be defining my terms? How do I turn this from something that clearly is a response to a prompt into a real paper that asks an initial question, motivates why we should care, tells me what the background is, tells me how the terms are defined, comes to a conclusion about that specific topic. You want to turn it from an essay prompt into a real, genuine paper. Explain the implications of the things that you're writing about. Consider objections in ways that you might not have done for a essay, for a term paper. And then finally, I think it's a good idea to make an outline. So you've already written this paper, but think about whether you want to add or remove sections, whether you want to think about how all the pieces fit together. You may move stuff around as you think about turning it from an essay prompt into a real paper. You want to be deliberate about whether a reader who's read 250 applications already is clearly going to see how the pieces of your paper fit together when you are the 251st. Clear? Oh, that was the end. Okay, we're not done yet. Okay, so then what you want to do next is think about how you want to expand the paper. So your main task here is to make everything deeper. You've got more space. You've got, if it's a standard 10-page seminar paper, you've got 2 to 10 more pages that you can add of material. And that's quite a bit. So, and like the paper that you'll read, when I wrote it as a seminar paper, it was 22 pages. When it was a writing sample, it was 18 pages. But I eliminated a lot of extraneous information, then I added in more stuff. So what you want to do first is to really get into the nitty-gritty. So you want to decompress. So this is a common flaw in undergraduate papers. It's a common flaw in my writing now. I took assumptions for granted. I didn't really know how I wanted to argue for this, so I just kind of waved my hands and said, well, clearly, obviously, this is all true, and then I moved on. If you say something's clear or obvious, it tends to be a sign that it's not clear, and you just want us to think that it's clear. So you want to read your paper closely, think about things that you weren't really sure how to address. Talk to your faculty member about how you can address those. The faculty member gave your paper an A, but she probably had some places where if this was going to be a writing sample, she would already have in mind that you could decompress your analysis, really argue clearly for the positions that you're taking, for the assumptions that you're making, and just not explaining in the paper as you wrote it first. So you may also want to connect more broadly and deeply to the literature. So if you're writing a history paper, you read the passage more closely, you consider more sources, you cite more contrasting views, you consider more objections. So if you're writing a term paper, maybe you have the space to think about one objection, and you sort of treat it uncharitably, and you run out of space to consider the response that person would give. So here, you start by considering that objection as charitably as you possibly can. What would a really smart person who thinks this say in response? And then maybe you add in more objections. Maybe you consider 2 objections. You give them a really fair shake, and then you can explain in detail why they didn't work. You offer more examples, so we can see how your proposal works, or places where it doesn't work, things future work would address. That could be great if you can say honestly, look, I don't know what to do with this, but in future work, I'd like to talk about this. Real philosophers do this all the time. It shows that you've got a plan, you've got a destination. That can look really good. And it can look really honest for you to say, here's a flaw in this plan. I'm addressing this the best I can. But in the future, I or somebody else should think seriously about what to do with X, Y, and Z. Now, you may also have the space to add a whole new argument, but you want to be careful here. So you've only got so much space, but you've also only got so much time. Do you have the time to write a new argument for this position and make it as strong as the stuff that's already in the paper? Do you have the space to deal really well with the first thing that you wrote, make it really polished, add in more objections, add in more literature, and also add something else. I think it's often better to refine what you have than to try to add something else that's entirely new in. But it varies depending on what your paper is, what the topic is, and that's where, again, advice from faculty, advice from us, advice from other undergrads can really help you figure out how much else you should try to do in the paper that you've got. And then I talked about this at the beginning with picking a topic, but again, you want to consider what can you do well in 15 pages? It's possible, again, even if you're not starting from scratch, to think, I can do more in this paper than I actually can, and that's a hallmark of writing that hasn't really been polished and considered. You don't want to think about proving something, you want to think about making progress. You don't want to think, I'm going to prove that God exists in this paper. You want to think, I'm going to make progress on this part of the question of God's existence, this small part. But I can make progress by showing my original analysis of this part of the question of God's existence. And then you also want to think about your writing. So I'm sure none of you do this, but every philosopher hates when we get undergrad papers that start with, since the dawn of time, man has wondered, is morality relative? I hate it so much. And this is another thing that's like, that varies from philosopher to philosopher. So we all have our nitpicks. You can't avoid every person's nitpicks when you're writing a writing sample, but you do the best you can with avoiding stuff like this. Start with something that's specific, that really talks about the question that you want to answer. Your paper will puff up the importance of this as you show us why we should care about whether utilitarianism is true. It doesn't matter if, since the dawn of time, man has wondered what utiles are and how many of them exist in the world. That just sounds so bad. I hate it so much. I really do. So your first sentence should be on topic. It should be specific. I rarely start with a first sentence. And in fact, I would recommend not starting with writing your introduction in general. Probably many of you have heard about writing advice. And often when I've written the paper, I find what I wrote initially turns out to be a totally fine first sentence for the paper. Because I haven't needed to start it with, I'm telling you should care about this. I'm starting by showing, and that turns out to be a pretty fine start to a paper. You want to minimize technical terms, so your readers can tell if you're just trying to impress them with how many philosophical terms you know. You will probably use some of them, and when you do, you should define them, and you should define them carefully. So when I teach ethics, and I teach deontology, I teach Kant because that's sort of the standard deontology, but there are lots of other versions of deontology that aren't Kantian deontology. So you wrote a paper on deontology for class, you assumed by deontology the reader knew you meant Kantian deontology, but when you're writing it as a writing sample, you want to say, what I take deontology to be for the purposes of this paper is deontology as Kant wrote about it, where you've got categorical imperatives and et cetera, you want to ask your professor, are the meanings of the terms that we learned in class the meanings that a standard philosopher would take when I say deontology or externalism or personal identity? You want to check on those because the terms you learn might not be the universally accepted meanings. And then you want to be careful about defining the terms. Then you want to choose quotations carefully. So you don't want to rely on quotations too much because what you want to show in this paper is your original analysis. But you probably quote some things sometimes. And then every time you do, you want to unpack them. You want to show why this quotation was so important that you needed to quote it and what it shows for your purposes. So you want to unpack every time you quote. And you want to show why we should believe that your interpretation and not some other interpretation of the quotation is correct. Then as you think about your voice, your committee members will be lazy. Admissions committee members are trying to do as little work as possible on each writing sample because they've got so many to read. They're not stupid or unsophisticated, but they may be mean and they'll probably be unfamiliar with your topic. So you want to write it as if they are all of these things because there'll be at least 2 or 3 of them. So explain everything carefully. Really focus on organizing your paper because as we'll talk about in a minute, many of them won't even read your entire paper. They'll read parts of it carefully. They might skim the rest of it. So you want them to be able to dip in and out and say, oh, I know what's going on. I have some questions about what came before, but then I can go back and read. But you want them to be able to see at any point in your paper what you're doing and why it matters. And then you don't want to aim for sophistication. You want that to come about naturally, which is hard. And your committee members aren't expecting you to be an nth level grad student or a professional philosopher. But you don't want to bring in extra philosophical machinery that isn't necessary for the job that you want to do. So when I discovered possible worlds in undergrad, like, I use those all the time. You know, in this possible world, we can see that consequentialism is true, and in this one, and it just sounds like I'm trying to puff up my own level of expertise beyond where it is. And a good philosopher will notice that. So don't bring in extra machinery to try to sound sophisticated, because it's likely to backfire on you. Any questions up till now? So you want to think also about how you're structuring your paper. So you want to make your thesis extremely clear early on. So for people, admissions committees often will read most or all papers, some, and then they'll select more to read carefully. The ones they're seriously considering, they'll read it carefully. So you want to think that people are going to be skimming your paper the first time around. So you want to show them what your thesis is very clearly in the introduction to your paper. Because for many of them, if they're not going to read a whole paper the first time around, they'll at least read the introduction somewhat carefully. So you want your thesis to be clear. You also want to signpost. You want to make the structure of your paper obvious with connective words, maybe with heading titles. You want them to be able to see where you've been and where you're going. And then again, many philosophers will read the conclusion. So you want your conclusion to summarize what you've shown, how you've shown it, how you got to where you are now. And you want your introduction and conclusion to match. So one really good reason to not start by writing the introduction to your paper is that as you go along in the writing process, you're likely to realize, I've really got to spend a lot of time on this objection. I can't address this other objection. And if you say in your introduction that your paper addresses these two objections, and then in your conclusion you talk about how you've addressed just one of them, it's really obvious to committee members that it isn't polished. So actually, I mean, this is not just something that undergraduates do. So when I referee papers for journals, sometimes I see people who have written their introduction, then written their paper, and it looks bad. Those are papers that I, at the least, don't accept, because it's clear that they haven't really thought carefully about how the introduction and conclusion summarize and signpost the different parts of the paper. And it's a sign the paper needs more work. So then there are a couple of philosophical mistakes. I mean, there are many philosophical mistakes that you can make in writing, but two are category mistakes and not flagging your assumptions. So if you say utilitarianism believes that, some philosophers think that theories can't have beliefs. People can have beliefs, but theories can't. And so philosophers vary by how much category mistakes bother them. You may get somebody who thinks, I know what she's trying to say, I'm going to give it to her. But there are some philosophers who really hate this stuff. And what you want to do is minimize the amount that people will hate what you write. So, because some of them are mean. And so you want to minimize stuff like this, where it's just going to stick in somebody's craw. And even if it's a good paper, whether it's charitable or good or right for them to do this, they'll say, God, I just came away with the impression that blah-de-blah's paper wasn't as good as it could have been. So category mistakes are one thing that tend to stick in some philosophers' craws. Another is not flagging the assumptions that you have here. So obviously, you minimize this. You don't want to say, in this paper, I will assume that we are not all brains and bats, and I will assume that our perceptions are veridical, and I will assume that moral relativism is false. But you want to keep in mind things that are relevant for the paper that you're writing. In this paper, I'm starting by assuming that consequentialism is true. And then the interesting question is, how do we deal with personal relationships within consequentialism? Those are the kinds of assumptions that you want to flag to show us that you've done your homework, that you're aware of other debates, but you're bracketing them for now, other related debates, not debates about brains and bats. And then, once you've done all this, you do it again, many more times, forever. So what you want to do is send your drafts to as many people as you can think of. And while you're sending them to them, take a couple days, take a week, don't work on your writing sample. This is why you want to start early, and then come back. Because you notice things you didn't notice about your own writing the first time when you come back after a breather and you look at it again. So send your paper to people, to everyone you can think of, to us, to other faculty, to faculty in other departments if you're close to them, to the writing center. See what they think of it. Then, especially if they're the main person you're working with, revise it and send it to them again. If they indicate, if they're not your main faculty member, but they indicate that they'll read it more, send it back to them. See what they think of the revision. And then read your paper out loud. See if it sounds like something a real person would say. This will actually go a long way to making your writing catch the eye of an admissions committee member. If it sounds interested and interesting, and if it sounds lively, and if it's not boring to read, it looks better when people are looking at your portfolio. And reading it out loud can, in addition to catching words you've missed, grammatical mistakes, it can also help you to see if it sounds like something you would actually say if you were talking to somebody about it, or if you were presenting it as a talk, which is also a great idea. If your department has undergraduate talks, you can try to talk through your paper in the form of a talk and see if it makes sense, see if it sounds good. And then talk through your main claims with somebody else. Talk to your mom if you feel like it would help. Talk to a friend who doesn't do philosophy. See if you can get them on board with what you're trying to say, with the structure of your paper. See what objections they have. If they're not really philosophically good objections, there might be a close version of them that is a philosophically good objection that you can address in your paper. See if that makes sense to people you're talking it out with. Then try writing an outline again, but this time just use your thesis statement and the topic sentences from each of your paragraphs. See if you can follow, or if somebody else can follow an outline that's just the beginnings of your paragraphs. That's a good indication that your paper is hanging together, and that somebody who's just skimming it and reading those topic sentences and reading the thesis statement will be able to follow it as an admissions committee member. And then really do actually go through your paper sentence by sentence. This is painful, it can be embarrassing to yourself about your own writing, but it really helps if you think, I'm gonna go through every sentence and see if I don't need this word, if I don't need this sentence, if I don't need this paragraph, if I don't need this concept. Try to cross out everything that isn't super necessary for your paper. That will make your writing stronger, it will make it more organized, it'll give you more space to do other stuff that you really do need to do in the course of writing your paper. And then, if you're like me, you won't be done with this. So I was not done with the process of revising my paper by the time I sent out my first writing sample. So UCSD has a later admissions deadline, and I don't think it's an accident that I got in here and not some schools with earlier deadlines, because I was still revising my paper right up until whenever our applications due. I think maybe it was like January 17th or something. So you don't want to do that, but you may be expecting to revise your paper over and over up until the deadline. And this is why, again, you should start early on this. Any questions about the process of revising? Yeah.
I have a quick question
What's your
just
name?
about that. Katie.
Katie.
So, especially, like, I've been told, at least by my professors, that, like, whatever you have done, you want to submit to the same school every time. Like, by the time due dates start coming up, you don't want to be editing, like, in between applications being due, because it's so easy to miss something. Like, especially when you're that stressed out. So do you, like, I mean, obviously, it's not recommended that you're still editing, you know, during that process, but is it absolutely killer to be, like, if you feel somewhat confident about your paper before application dates start coming, like around December 1st, should you just stop then, or?
Yeah, so this is true of the grad school seminar. Last time it's true of this seminar, it's true of the careers panel. People give you advice that's suited to what they themselves needed. And so for me, it was better for me to keep revising the paper, because it wasn't I didn't feel like it was as strong as it could have been. And it was stronger by the time my final deadline was there. But if you are the kind of person who needs to just be done with something, and that's a totally legitimate thing to do, then it might be best for you to send your paper off and just think, I'm done with this, I'm gonna go enjoy Christmas, I'm gonna go enjoy the final, like, at the end of my fall semester, my senior year, and not worry about this anymore. That's also totally legitimate. And that'll just depend on who you are as a person, how you work, what kinds of other stresses are going on in your life, and how good you felt your paper was when your first deadlines were due. So it's best if you can avoid making that decision, but given that I had to make that decision, maybe some of you will too, you'll just have to decide based on the kind of person you are, and the kind of writer that you are.
Okay.
But that's a good perspective from your professors too, that makes sense also. It's not what I would have done, but it may make sense for lots of people. Okay. Okay, so that's how you might want to go about writing a writing sample. What kinds of things do people on an admissions committee look for? So I asked a bunch of people from past UCSD admissions committees, and here are some of the things that they had to say. So it's very important that you work with other people, which is one of the things that I've been saying a bunch of times, but they can tell if you've tried to revise something on your own. When I was working on my writing sample, I talked to the professor I was working with. He said, okay, let's talk about this, like read it, send me a revised version, and I'll see what I think. So I sent him this version. I worked really hard on revising it, and he said, okay, these are good revisions to the style, but we need to work on the revisions to the philosophy. And I thought I'd really been getting deeply into it, but I wasn't as good at revising as I thought I was, because I was coming at it with less expertise than he had. So you really do want to work with other people on it. Then one of them said, look, if you run it by two good up-to-date philosophy revisers and they say this is a good writing sample, then they're probably right. Now, one question here is, how do you know which philosophy professors at your school are good and up-to-date? This is a tough question, especially if you're coming from a smaller department. One way to do this is to check their CVs, see if they've published stuff recently, if they've been active in the profession, if they are younger, they're more likely to be active in the profession, but older faculty can also be active. But if they seem like they've been involved in philosophy recently beyond just teaching it, I think that's what this person meant by up to date. And that doesn't mean that everybody who's involved in philosophy is a good philosopher or vice versa, but it's likelier that they will be having a sense of what admissions committees want to see. And this is again where the summer program can be a resource, because the faculty at UCSD are good up-to-date philosophy professors, and so they'll be happy to be a sounding board for you if you send us your writing samples. So what should you write about? One person said you should make a serious attempt at originality while being appropriately respectful of other work in the area. So again, you don't want to choose something that's too broad. If you say you're going to prove that utilitarianism is true, you just aren't going to be able to be respectful of the non-utilitarians who are also good philosophers. So you want to read the literature, do your homework, acknowledge those things in your writing sample, but you want to make a serious attempt at originality. So again, if you try to just start something from scratch, this is where originality backfires, because you're not engaged with current philosophical work. But when this person says originality, I think what he or she meant was you don't want to be completely original in a way that goes off the rails. You want to just not stick to interpretation of existing philosophers or comparing and contrasting two authors. That's a popular essay topic in undergrad classes. But just comparing and contrasting, you do a lot of discussion of literature, and then maybe at the end you do something slightly, like you say, well, I side with Singer over Mill. What you want to do is say, no, here's my original thing. Singer's right, Mill's wrong, and here's a new reason to think that again, makes a little bit of progress, but doesn't do something that's completely new. Then somebody else said it's better usually for applicants to choose topics that are related to what they're thinking about possibly studying. But again, this comes with the caveat that if you have never written a paper in that area, which is something people do, people come in and say, look, nobody at my school did philosophy of mind, but I know this is what I want to do because I loved my psychology classes. But here's where letters of recommendation or your personal statement can do that work for you. And instead you send a really polished paper on ethics. So if you've got a paper on philosophy of mind, you send that in. If you don't, you send a paper in on ethics. Somebody else said, were there references in the writing sample to the work that you're proposing to work with? So this is something that will bug some people more than others. So I don't think this is necessary. If there's something you're really interested in right now, or a good writing sample given the classes that you've taken, you may not be able to tailor it to a specific school. Or if you're applying to 15 schools, you can't write a new writing sample that takes advantage of the people at every school. You'll go out of your mind trying to do that. So what you want to do is, if you know that there's somebody you really want to work with at a school, and you're applying to the University of Chicago because Martha Nussbaum works there, and you love capabilities stuff, and you want to do the capabilities approach forever, it would look really bad if you didn't cite Martha Nussbaum. Or if somebody's really central in a debate, it looks like you haven't done your homework if you don't cite them. So if you're writing on philosophy of religion, and you send a writing sample in, people at UCSD don't have philosophy of religion as a major area. They'll look at your writing sample carefully if it's good, and if you say in your personal statement, I really want to do philosophy of biology instead. But it would be, you shouldn't stretch to include somebody from UCSD just because you're applying here. But if you're writing a paper on moral and legal responsibility, and you don't cite David Brink, he might notice that. So you wanna, again, this is where familiarity with literature will help you. So don't go looking for people to include. But if there's somebody obvious, they may notice, and their feelings may be hurt in a way that you don't want if you fail to include them. And then again, things that we've been talking about. Do you present a clear problem? Do you formulate it clearly? Do you assess alternative solutions to the problem? These are the things you may have done well in your term paper and your thesis, but you may want to do better in your writing sample. What else should it be like? Focused, clear, precise, analytically rigorous, easy to read and follow, and well organized. It should be all of those things, so good luck. Another person said really what he or she wanted was the ability to write clearly and concisely, analytical sophistication, a serious commitment to the discipline. These are the things you should be striving for. And then here's where admissions committee members have different feelings on what it should be like. So one person said the essay shouldn't be too long. Another person said send an essay that's too long with a cover letter, an abstract, advice about which sections should be read, should be focused on. And so here I think one person was fine with a too long paper, another person wasn't, and you probably want to aim to make as few people upset as possible. So the person who thinks it's fine to send a too long writing sample won't be disappointed if it's a short writing sample. The person who thinks it shouldn't be too long will be disappointed if it is too long. It might stick in their craw. So you want to try to aim for impressing as many people and irritating as few people as possible. So we've got different advice, but I think it's pretty clear which of these two pieces of advice you should take. Another person says don't contain any grammatical errors or typos. When I said don't contain any grammatical errors, that was sort of in itself maybe not syntactically beautiful. So read it over, have the writing center read it over. It just looks unprofessional and unpolished if you've got a lot of spelling errors in your paper. And then when another person says use precise language to express abstract thoughts, so again, good luck doing that. But these are some things that people on admissions committees are looking for. Then how do they read it? One person says, look, I read the title. If there's an abstract, which again, I think this was the person who said you can include an abstract if it's too long. I think writing samples don't necessarily include abstracts. I suppose you could. I don't know that it's super necessary, but you might want to. But this person reads that carefully, reads the first and last paragraphs, I don't know why. I think this was Monty, who loves bibliographies. Other people may not put as much attention on bibliographies. Anyways, but this otherwise, details about bibliographies, this is a fairly standard practice. You read some parts of it carefully, tend to read the intro, the conclusion, skim parts in the middle, maybe dip into a section, at least in the initial stages. And then if your paper makes it past the first cut, they read the whole thing carefully. Then another person says, look, I don't pay so much attention to writing samples unless they're really terrible or brilliant. So again, this advice varies person to person. This person, I think, pays more attention to GRE scores. So, doing your writing sample, making it as strong as you can is the best bet, but you will get some people who aren't really paying attention to it. But that's why you want your application package to be strong everywhere. And you want your writing sample to be strong everywhere because you don't know where somebody's going to dip in to read just a section. And then this is the advice about split decisions that I said before. If there's a split decision, it's likely that it won't go in your favor, so you may just want to put your best foot forward initially. And then somebody else says, look, we'd rather have philosophy papers, but some admissions committees will make allowances. So we'd rather have papers that are really strong, really good, but if you say, look, I just learned about philosophy, or I just learned about philosophy of religion, some people will make allowances, others won't. That's the tough part about applying to grad school, but this person thought in general, admissions committees tend to approach your writing sample in light of the rest of your file. So hopefully that's true, because I think that is the right way to go about it, but it's not guaranteed that everyone will do that. Any questions on any of this advice so far?
I'm actually a little bit scared about the bibliography. My mentor keeps telling me, like, he says submits a paper to a journal, and he's freaking out that someone who's reading it isn't someone who he cited. And that worries me a lot, that I'm going to, because, I'm going to cite as many people as I possibly can read in order to get them into my paper, and I'm going to miss, I don't know, this one ethics prof who works at this university who's butthurt now.
Yeah, welcome to professional philosophy. So I sent a paper off to a journal, and like 2 weeks after that, a friend of mine said, oh, I see from your website that you wrote a paper on this. You might want to read a related paper I'd never heard of. And it was very similar to my paper. And that just happens. It happens to your mentor for a reason. It happens to professional philosophers. So all you can do is do the best you can. And that's all you can do. And it's possible that you'll miss a paper that matters, and that happens to everybody. Now, for admissions committees, the hope is that they'll be generous and realize that you're coming at this as a 22 or 25-year-old with limited access to a library maybe, with just the advice of one or two people. So the standards certainly should be lower. I think for most people they are than for graduate school work or for published work. But it's possible that you miss something, and it just happens to everybody.
Okay, just like follow up. So the bibliography length was definitely not included in that, between 12 and 18 length.
Yeah, I don't think that includes the bibliography, because I think most people won't be like this one person and read the bibliography carefully. It's best if you can include it in the length. So you're probably not going to have a 5-page bibliography for a 20-page writing sample. If you do, that seems like you're stuffing the...
Right, well, I have a 12-page paper with, literally, my bibliography is half the length of the paper. And I am still thinking, how much more can I get into this, how much more can I read, how much more can I cite, because it's just been I guess my mentor just kept telling me over and over and over, this is what happens to you. And and I guess also, I kind of was wondering, should I just be in the length of the paper? If I'm moving it up to 15, is it worth spending another 3 pages addressing other people's responses? Or should I leave that to the footnotes, or should I just stop with this whole crazy trying to read everything?
Yeah, I mean, boy. So of course this varies by area. So if your paper is a history paper, you may be citing more things than a person writing in ethics would. And so I come from ethics and political philosophy, so I may be used to fewer citations than people in other areas. But I guess I think if you read stuff just so you can cite it, that kind of thing shows to an admissions committee member. It suggests you're trying, and that matters. But it's not as good as picking fewer sources and dealing with them really carefully.
In the work, and not even in the footnotes.
Yeah, and footnotes can be useful for saying, you might, blah de blah has a different view that I don't have time to go into here. That can show that you've read stuff. But if you're doing that on every page, again, that feels like ballot stuffing. Where
okay.
you're
Yeah, that's kind of what I was asking about. Because I feel like I'm doing that. Like, there's times when I'm not even like, I didn't even read this fully, but I have a big idea of how to summarize.
Mhm.
Just say, oh yeah, I can't talk about that here, and it just doesn't. I don't know. Like maybe that's just
Yeah.
gonna look worse if I'm doing that.
there's a risk to that somebody who reads your writing sample will know that paper and say, oh, this person's citing a ton of stuff, and I've read this paper, and I know that this isn't really in this paper, and so that's a risky thing. I would advise against it because, you probably won't find somebody who's read the exact paper you're citing, but you could, especially because many of you will be writing on classic texts of philosophy because that's what you read in undergrad. That's what you're likely to write on in your grad school writing sample. So it's good to show that you have read more than just what you were assigned for class. But if your choice is between reading 3 more articles or reading another book versus spending more time polishing what you've already got, I think I would advise you to spend your time on the writing you've got. Of course, this is why you start early, so you don't have to make that choice, but I think sending off a writing sample that's really strong matters more than having a really extensive bibliography.
And then I guess the last thing, sorry, I guess I have more questions about the bibliography, but just plugging the gaps is such a problem for me because I don't really know how to, it's easy to find endless stuff on a topic, but it's really difficult for me to figure out who are the philosophers that I really should be citing and who do we just not care about, and finding the recent stuff that's happened in the past few years and just, because I don't have I have profs who work in this area, but it's not like anyone is writing on exactly what I'm writing on.
It's mean to say who we don't care about, but in some sense that's true, both in terms of who's popular right now and also in terms of who's doing the best work on a subject. You are not necessarily in the best position to judge that. So one resource is your faculty members. Another resource is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So if you go look at the article on Nietzsche's moral philosophy, you might be able to get a good idea of who's being cited a lot in things that are addressing really central questions of Nietzsche's moral philosophy. That can be a good resource for not just what your professor thinks, but what the field thinks about people. You're probably going to get it wrong, just because you don't have a lot of experience being a professional
That's
philosopher
why I was
yet.
going for so many. I was like, if I cite everyone, some of them have to be important.
Yeah, stop clocks right twice a day.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where we hope that admissions committees make allowances, and I think admissions committees genuinely try to make allowances. Some of them are better at that than others, but they are aware that you are coming out of a particular undergraduate program. And so I think most of them are trying, at least, to approach this with a mindset of making allowances for, you're not having studied this stuff for 25 years yet. So I would encourage you to focus on the writing, focus on the substance, read more stuff if you have time, and then I would encourage an admissions committee to be aware of the situation that you're coming from, and that only half of that is under your control, but that's what I think for you.
Thanks. This is really helpful.
A very small practical question, but when we say page numbers like this, is that single or double spaced?
Generally double.
Okay.
Yeah. So most people will be double spacing. Right. So that's a good point. So it should be double spaced.
Okay.
Yeah. Slides for next year. Any other questions so far? Yeah.
So I'm not sure where this question fits, but how worried do we have to be about a paper being too fringe or too technical? So if I wanted to write a technical paper in decision theory, would it be better to submit a paper on disagreement instead?
I don't think so. So again, this will vary from school to school, and so my best guess is it's best to submit your strongest work even if it's technical. And what tends to happen is if it's too technical for the 3 to 5 people on the admissions committee, they'll bring in somebody else to read it. Somebody else from elsewhere in the department who can better assess the quality of the paper. So that's on them. And most of them will take pretty seriously the need to assess your paper fairly. And of course, some people are really impressed by technical stuff. So I would not worry about that. You know, it may be a problem some places, but I think the bulk of places would try really hard to give it a fair shake, sending it to other people if they have to.
Is there any concern that the type of reasoning or things that get said in a paper like that aren't mainstream enough, or a paper in the disagreement literature would better exhibit whatever philosophical skills you're looking for?
So what you want to show throughout your admissions file is that you're the kind of grad student who would really flourish in this department. And so if you send off a really technical paper in decision theory and you say, oh, my only love is decision theory, and that's all I want to do until the day I die, and there's nobody at the school who does decision theory, then that's really bad. But you can make up for something that might seem like a fringe area to you by talking about other elements of your file. So when you, if it seems fringe, if your faculty members tell you it's fringe, you can say in your personal statement, and your faculty members can say in their letters, she wrote this paper. And in fact, what they should be doing if they're writing letters of recommendation or write is placing your writing sample in context. So what's your name?
Haley.
Haley. So Haley wrote this really good paper in decision theory, but she's also got strengths in other areas. And this is indicative of her promise in this area, but you can also see, I really like this one argument that she develops. A good faculty member will be writing a letter that does that kind of placing your writing sample in context. And then you can do that too in your personal statement. So I love decision theory because of its connections to other disciplines, but I also love it because it has connections to areas in political philosophy or epistemology that I'm also really interested in. So I think if you're worried about that, you can mitigate it by placing it in context in the rest of your file. But I think good admissions committees will make allowances because, gosh, I don't know, like one place I applied to last year had somebody who just did philosophy of creative writing, and that was like half of their faculty. And so most admissions committees will get that you're shaped by the people who are your faculty in your undergraduate program, and they'll be aware that if you're writing on an area they consider fringe or you consider fringe, that might be because of where you're coming from. Yeah.
My name's Gabby.
Gabby.
So I am more inclined towards interdisciplinary work, and I'm actually not sure if I'm more interested in psychology or sociology or philosophy. And so my question is, I'm considering applying out to PhD programs in philosophy and psychology at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
How appropriate is it to bring in empirics into like developing philosophical arguments? I'm really interested in moral psychology and the intersection between psychology and philosophy. And so I wonder like how aware do I need to be of like relying on empirics to build an argument, using those, citing them, obviously like bringing in literature that a department may not even be familiar with at all.
So it's totally appropriate. It's also very cutting edge right now, and it's also very impressive to philosophers because many of us think science is in some sense the gold standard for knowledge. And so whenever somebody brings in a study, we think, well, that must be right. It's actually kind of a flaw of a lot of philosophers that we tend to take the word of the latest study as kind of like the final word. So in that sense, you should do it. But you want to be aware that a philosopher is going to look for, they may not understand the import of a particular empirical fact, so you want to explain very clearly, and B, most philosophers will want to know not just the cool result, but what does it mean for philosophy? So in your philosophical writing sample, you want to be able to say, not just psychology seems to show us this, but also that has these ramifications for ethics. And then that's going to require you to bring in then, the stuff that you do in any philosophy paper, considering objections, both empirical and normative. So I think it's a great idea, especially if you're applying to places with interdisciplinary programs. But you want to make sure that the philosophy is as up to snuff as the empirical part is. Anything else for them?
So I guess this is also on sort of subject selection. I've heard that there are some areas of philosophy that are kind of considered, you know, more rigorous or difficult, areas like metaphysics and epistemology. And so I have interest in some of those areas, like I like metaphysics, but what I'm really, really interested in, and I think I want to go into, is ethics. And so do you think it might be unwise to, you know, do things in ethics areas because it might not be considered, you know, as difficult and rigorous, you know, a paper that might be equally as good, but because it's in that subject area?
Yeah, so what you say is true. There are people who have this view that things in metaphysics, traditional epistemology are the most rigorous, in some sense the best area of philosophy. I think that view is bad, and I think it's wrong, but there are people who are probably on admissions committees who will have that view. So then what do? So about ethics specifically, ethics tends to be, at least by courtesy, lumped in with the things that are rigorous. So an ethics paper itself may not give cause for concern on this particular issue, but it depends on what you're doing in ethics. So knowing that some people have this wrong and bad view, what should you do? For one thing, you want to ask your mentors about the character of the department you're thinking about applying to. Because if everybody thinks metaphysics and epistemology are where it's at, everybody in that department, and the people who do ethics in that department are less well respected or seen as sort of taking the soft way out, is that a department you think you would be at home in? So hopefully any department you're applying to will not have this sort of problematically rigorous conception of what philosophy is, and so they'll take a sample in ethics or philosophy of race or feminist philosophy or philosophy of disability as seriously as any other philosophy, as they should. But you know, they may not. And so then, again, I think maybe this is too simplistic, and tell me if you don't think this answers your question, but I think they're more likely to take a stronger writing sample in ethics or philosophy of race seriously than a writing sample on central areas in metaphysics that you cooked up at the last minute to try to get admission to their program. So I would still stick with what you think is really strong. If you've got 2 papers and one of them is on a core area of philosophy, if you feel like it represents you as a philosopher, then you may consider writing that one, working on that one as a strategic move, even though I think it's a strategy you shouldn't have to employ. But that is where some departments are more or less right now. But again, I think that's wrong and bad. So. Yeah.
Sort of going off of Jasmine's question, like if you're applying to a department because they have like 1 or 2 people that work in your field and it's sort of like a fringe field, like what I have in mind right now, which my writing sample is on, is Black feminist epistemology. So, and I'm like applying to Michigan State because Christy Dotson works there, and my paper is actually about Christy Dotson's work, but like if she's not on the admissions committee and it's like other people who are like, you know, not as familiar with like her work or maybe even the background that goes with her work, how much should I spend my writing sample like explaining what it is I'm doing?
You should you should spend time explaining what you're doing. They may have a good idea of her work, maybe they don't, they probably have some idea of it, but you should spend a good amount of time on explaining it just because you want it to be a strong standalone piece. Now, if they don't get it when they're reading it, they're likely to send it to her for her evaluation and analysis. They may not do work in Black feminist epistemology, but they may say, this is great. This person, what's your name?
Tina.
Tina? Tina may, like, it's great. Like, she clearly wants to work with Christy Dotson. Like, this may be a really good fit for our program. So, like, their lack of expertise in exactly what Christy Dotson does won't prevent them from giving it its full consideration. But you should be explaining stuff just because that's how good writers write, and not, you know, because other people may not be familiar and you're not sure that she's going to be interested in you. And you shouldn't not explain it on the assumption that they'll be familiar with it because she works there or because she might be on the committee. Okay. Moving on to some resources that you might use in your writing. So, one is to know how you write. Do you write best in the morning? Do you write best late at night? Do you feel like the best thing for you is to get up a lot of philosophers do this, get up, write for an hour before they check their email, and then if they don't get anything else done for the rest of the day, at least they've gotten somewhere on their writing. So I use this technique, the Pomodoro technique. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. You write for, or do whatever your work is for like 25 minutes, and then you take a break for 5 minutes. And then you do that 4 times, and then at the end of those 4 times, your break is half an hour. So it's a way to intersperse focused work, focused writing with making sure that you get breaks. So that works well for me, but it may not work well for you. You may need to set aside an entire afternoon where you just write. So trying out different strategies for writing and mixing up how you write can be really helpful, both in working on your writing sample and in pursuing long-term writing projects like a dissertation. But people write differently. I like Style by Joseph M. Williams. I think it's a really nice manual for not just like conventions of grammar, but like how you develop a voice, how you organize a paper. So I'd recommend getting a copy of that off of Amazon and referring to it as you write this and other things. Again, your campus writing center can be really great for the writing aspects of writing a writing sample. And then you don't have to obviously write these links down, but they'll be on my website. They'll be on, hopefully on the summer programs website, Catherine's nodding yes. So here are a bunch of different guidelines for philosophy papers, generally for admissions, focusing partly on writing samples, including one by David that he probably referenced yesterday. So you can refer to those as you go about working on your writing sample and the rest of admission stuff. And then some software programs that may or may not be helpful for you now or later, and I believe all of these are free. So Scrivener is a program that is useful for a large writing project, including maybe a writing sample. You can build separate smaller files, and then you can combine them as you see fit, and they may change over time, so it's a nice way to organize your writing. So some people in our department do that, break writing down into smaller sections, and then come back and arrange and rearrange them. So Scrivener is good for that. Zotero is one citation management source. So this is the one that I use. So it's a little browser extension. You can, whenever you read a paper, you can write down citation information in it, and then it will format it in, I think that it has whatever 10 different citation styles, and so it will just take the information you've given it and spit back out a citation in APA or Chicago or Turabian or whatever you need. And you can also take notes. So I find it helpful to jot down a couple of impressions or something that I really want to keep in mind for future, so that then when I come back to a paper I haven't read for 2 or 3 years, I can look at my notes on it. So that's a useful tool. Yeah.
Sorry, while you're here, is there a preferred citation style for a writing sample?
No, philosophy doesn't have one. So you just make it clear how you're citing things. You can, I mean, I think lots of people use MLA or Chicago. Those maybe are the most common, but so like, philosophy just does not have a single house style, which when you start submitting things to journal articles turns out to be a real pain. But yeah, so any citation style that you think can clearly communicate your resources. Also, philosophy does not have a standard convention on like endnotes versus footnotes, or footnoting citations versus parenthetical citations. I and like most of the people I know in academia strongly prefer footnotes to endnotes because it's easier to read them than like having to turn the page to the end and flip back, but you can do either. But why would you ever want to do endnotes? So then Mendeley is another citation manager like Zotero. I believe it also has a social network component, but to my knowledge, nobody who's not in the sciences uses that. Maybe some philosophers do, but I don't know about them. But that's also very similar to Zotero, so you can try them out, see what works for you. Again, also, I forgot to say this, both of these, Zotero and Mendeley, will let you keep PDF files in one place. So if you want a place to store all of the PDFs of the articles that you use for your writing sample or for other projects, you can store them there. And then some of you, yeah.
Does it store them on the cloud or on your computer?
I don't know. I'm sure you could find that information on either of those websites, but I honestly don't know. Yeah.
Can you export the citations to BibTeX?
I believe so. I believe both of them have that capability, but despite what I'm about to say about LaTeX, I don't actually know BibTeX or use it, so I couldn't tell you for sure. But I think they can. And then this is just the last one. So if you ever do any formal work or if you ever read papers in the sciences, most of them are written using LaTeX because it's a really nice way to format formulas and things like that. So it's less common, becoming more common in philosophy. You certainly don't have to write your writing sample in this, but it's another thing that some people like to do with writing because it looks kind of nice. I don't use it, and if you use it, so you can do this thing where you do the like markup language and then it comes out looking really nice, but there are also much more user-friendly interfaces that you can download, and they look more like a standard word processor. So if you want to use LaTeX, you can. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just also going to point out, when I use LaTeX, it looks like code, it's not code. So like begin document starts the page, it looks like code, it's not code. So don't be afraid.
Yeah, and if you're afraid, which is what has always kept me from learning it, just because I'm afraid and also a little bit lazy about it, and also do ethics, so I don't need it. There are, like I said, other, like, I forget what they're called, but you can Google like LaTeX interface and find lots of programs you can download that will make it like you're writing in Word. It just looks nicer. So, you know, if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't learn LaTeX just to have a writing sample that looks really beautiful. But the fact is, many philosophers use this, and the stuff does look really pretty. And yeah.
When I was a physics student, primarily, I used a LaTeX environment called Tech Studio, and it's really good, and it's all color coded, so it doesn't feel like code at all.
Okay, cool. So there's one, Text Studio. Okay, so this is the end of the presentation part, and we're going to do an exercise after this, but any other questions about any aspect of writing samples, the process, these resources, anything you've thought of that you haven't asked yet?
Amy.
Kathleen.
Hey, so I just wanted to say that first off, I know there's at least an option for Zotero that's cloud-based. So maybe you can also do hard drive-based, but at least there's a cloud-based option. And Scrivener is not free; it's like $45.
Oh,
at least that I have not been able to find a free version. I'm sure you can get Scrivener for free.
Yeah, I
but
think Tanya said it was free, so you may have to ask her where she got it.
well, good.
John
Well, then
also
hopefully,
is remembering.
I'm hopefully wrong about this. But every time I've tried to find Scrivener,
Okay.
it's been
Well,
not
sorry.
free. But no.
Legitimately free or like?
Catherine does ethics, guys. Okay, yeah.
Is there any, so I know you say that you should have, during the revision process, you should go to, several resources to look at your work, but is there, at some point, is there any, point where I really just need to be talking to these two people about, because I feel like you could, down the line, as these revisions are being made, you can get conflicting advice and.
Yeah, good, and that's something that we didn't talk about that I should have said. So there are two issues here. One is conflicting advice, and the other is just exhaustion and just tinkering for the sake of tinkering. So you can get people who disagree, and in fact, probably you will get people who disagree about what you should do with your writing sample. And you may get them early, or you may get the more people you send it to. I think the advantages of sending it to a lot of people outweigh this, but the chances are greater that people will disagree about what you should do. And so then, what do? I think to some extent you can go with your own gut. You've done philosophy, you're good at philosophy. There are some places where like, if something doesn't feel right to you, you shouldn't do it. But if you're really torn between two philosophers who are disagreeing, two people who've written letters for you, you go with the person, I think, in general, who knows the literature best and whom you trust more. So if the main person you're working with says you should do one thing, and somebody who's read your writing sample less says you should do something else, I think in general, you should go with the person who's read it more, who knows this stuff better. But that's not a foolproof strategy. But it's likely that you'll get conflicting advice. And then at some point, you probably will have read your paper 20 times, a million times, I don't know, and you will start tinkering with stuff just for the sake of tinkering with stuff. So a good way to head that off is to set your paper aside for a week and come back to it and say, is this still a change that I really need to make? But at some point, you should just be done with it. Maybe that's when you send off your first application, maybe you're like me and you keep tinkering with it for later, and you know, that depends on the kind of person you are, how far along your writing sample is, but philosophers are really bad at knowing, and academics in general are really bad at knowing when to be done with something. And this is just a skill that we're all bad at, and you're gonna have to decide for yourself based on your stress levels, based on whether it feels like you're adding new information or just reframing the old information, whether you're really done or not. And, you know, good luck figuring out when that is. Yeah, but it is absolutely possible to send something to too many people or to look at a piece of writing too much. It's unlikely that you will hit that in the amount of time you have, but it's possible. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so what we're going to do now is review two pieces of paper. So the piece of paper that I'm passing out to you now, or the few pieces of paper, is a seminar paper that I wrote and got an A, so it was probably pretty good. And then, so what you're going to do is take 5 or 10 minutes to read it and think about things the paper does well and the paper does badly and could be improved. And then we'll talk about those. And then after that, we'll look at the writing sample version of it and see what changed and what can still be improved. So just take a few minutes and look at that. And also, I want to say the introduction is a big part of the introduction. The body paragraphs don't follow directly from it. So if stuff is confusing, that's just because it's the middle of the paper, like an admissions committee member might see. So think about how it flows, but don't expect it to flow perfectly.